Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. Please just give us a few minutes while we wait for others to join. Okay, we'll get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual tour of the Timken Museum. We're so excited to have you with us this morning. A few housekeeping things before we get started. Please keep yourselves muted throughout today's presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Zoom chat function by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen that says chat in order to type your question. We'd be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of today's tour. If you're joining us over from Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. You can also ask any questions you may have using the comment section on Facebook. We'll be monitoring those comments and answering those questions at the end of the tour as well. Lastly, this tour is being recorded and streamed live and will be posted to our social media channels once the tour is over. If you would like to rewatch this tour or watch other tours put on by the Timken Museum previously, please check out our YouTube or our Facebook pages to find those. Without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce Karen, who will be presenting on Artists and Their Mentors, Part 2. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I'll turn things over to you, Karen.
Thank you so much, Ilse. I do love the idea of questions at the end of the talk, so please feel free. We can have a little dialogue. No question is uninteresting to me, and it really helps to kind of understand what I've talked about. So please feel free to ask questions. Now, a couple of months ago, I thought about the idea of mentorship in art. And fortunately, in our Timken collection, we have a lot of artists who actually have their mentors in the collection. So I'll give you an example. We have a wonderful Peter Paul Rubens, for example, and we also have next to it Anthony Van Dyck, who studied with Rubens. But this talk is a little different. I'm actually using some latitude in the mentor relationship. What I decided to do is do a little more of an esoteric look. Sometimes artists weren't always just influenced by their mentors. Sometimes they work with other artists, sometimes they were rivals of other artists, and sometimes they did study under other artists. So I did want to talk to you just a minute about mentorship. And here we have our wonderful Rembrandt and St. Bartholomew. And the reason why we use this image is because Rembrandt had a very active studio in Amsterdam, and he trained many artists, as did Peter Paul Rubens in Antwerp. So this idea of mentorship is really pervasive in art history. Now, the definition of mentorship is an experienced and trusted advisor who helps someone learn their craft. So why are artists so tied to this mentorship and also patronage? It's because it's always been, since the early part of the Renaissance, it's been really important for artists to have connections to other artists. They worked in workshops, they worked in their studios, sometimes they completed the work of their teachers and mentors. And also many of these artists, particularly in the Renaissance, were aided by patronage, for example, of the Medici family, Sforza family. So that was really important. So that's kind of tied in with this idea of mentorship. The other thing I think is really interesting is even in contemporary art, if you look at the English artist, Jeff Koons, who's a bazillionaire because he's been so successful, he has a whole cadre of artists who create through his inspiration, sort of like a conceptual idea that is thus taken over by his helpers. Even going back to Andy Warhol in the 60s in the factory, he had a group of artists who he trained and who supported his work. So this idea of mentorship is about who supported these artists, who helped them create their work, and how they were influenced. So sometimes when we look at these images, these two paintings, for example, side by side, the first one I'm going to show you, you'll see very clear back and forth with these two artists. So we're going to begin with Luca Caravaros, and he is in our amazing Timken collection, and Caspar van Wittel. So let's start. If you just take a moment to look at these two images, you can see that one is Venice, the top, the Caravaros, and the one at the bottom is Rome. So let's talk about these paintings. These were called venduta, and venduta is a singular in Italian for view, and they were considered topographical views. In fact, both men were influenced by mathematics and architecture. In fact, Caspar van Wittel was instrumental in drawings and engineering ideas for damming the Tiber River. So not only were they artists, but they actually were involved with architectural design and engineering feats, particular van Wittel. So let's look at the top at our wonderful Caravaggio's. And if you can look at the dates, you see that they're very close. So let me explain. And in this quote, mentorship, we have more of a cross-pollination. It wasn't so much that Caravaggio's worked in the studio of van Wittel, but they were connected by the type of work they did. And van Wittel was actually Dutch. He, however, spent most of his working life in Italy, most of it in Rome, but he did travel to Venice and other parts of Tuscany. Well, Venice isn't in Tuscany, parts of Tuscany. And Caravaggio's mostly worked in Venice, but he did go to Rome where he looked at the work of van Wittel. So they were very closely aligned. And you can see that when you look at these two paintings. So let's look at the Caravaggio's, as I mentioned. This is the Piazzetta before Piazza San Marco. Now, 2 years ago, I was in Italy, in Venice, and I would look at this, the image in my mind from the Timken, and I would say, is it really pretty true to its presentation? And it is. I mean, it's not perfectly true, but it very much still looks like this today. So what do we have here is a fowl market. It's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Remember, Venice was a great trading center, and people would come in from North Africa and other countries, and they would trade. And this one is a fowl market for birds. And it's at the end of the day when people have finished their trading and they're talking and summing up the day. And you notice a lot of people like in turbans and fezzes, the hats, and it's because of the importance of Venice as a trading center. Now, on the left of the painting, the Caravaggio's, the top painting, you see the library of San Savino, designed by San Savino. On the right, you have the Doge's palace. The Doge was the prince. And a couple, I think it was 2 months ago, I did a talk on Venetian Renaissance, and we talked about the Doge as being sort of the main principal aristocrat in Venice. If you look single point perspective to the back, you see the beautiful St. Mark's Cathedral, which actually began in the 9th century. You have Hadrian's column to the left, and you have also the St. Mark's, the winged lion, which represents Venice on the right. You can tell that Caravaggio was a mathematician because look at all the detail and the perspective he incorporates in the painting. The other thing that's really quite remarkable is that he painted from a boat down below. So the perspective is quite unusual. Now, look at the beautiful clouds. He's a master at capturing not only perspective, but the multitude of people on the piazza, the little plaza before the main square. And then we have all these architectural elements, these arcades and colonnades, and they're just amazing for their detail. And the same can be said of Von Whittle. So this is Rome. And what we have here is the Pamphile family, an aristocratic family, commissioned Van Whittle to paint this and document some of the work that they were doing in Rome. So the Pamphile Palace is on the left, as is the Church of St. Agnes. Now, in the center is Bernini's Four Rivers Fountain. And so that is a really important element to the center. But you can see such influence back and forth between these two men. They lived around the same time, although Van Whittle predates Caravaggio by a few years, but they were obviously both interested in the same kind of architectural drawings, these venduta, these views. And one other thing, besides Caravaggio, Van Whittle also influenced another great painter of Venice, and that is Canaletto. So again, this is a unique kind of mentorship in which Caravaggio went to Rome. He studied the work of Van Whittle. Van Whittle eventually went to Venice, and saw the work of Caravaggio. So I think this is a very nice pairing of two artists whose work was similar. They had similar intellectual interests with architecture and engineering, and we can see a lot of similarities. Now, we have this beautiful Francesco de Zurbarán. And in the San Diego Museum of Art, we have this Juan Sanchez de Coton. And you might say, well, you just showed us architectural drawings. Why are you showing us a still life and a saint? That is because, well, a couple reasons. One, I wanted to compare it to our own Zurbarán, which is in our collection. And you must know that Zurbarán did a couple of the most amazing still lifes ever created in the Spanish Baroque. And one of those still life with roses, lemons, is in the Norton Simon collection. And I've talked about that at great length. But you can have two religious paintings with different subject matter. So how did they interact? It's not quite clear, and I did quite a bit of research on it. It's not quite clear to me where exactly Zurbarán met Coton. But let's just say that Coton, who predates Zurbarán a little earlier, his work was so inspirational and instrumental to the development of Spanish Baroque. So he was a very prolific artist. He did join a Carthusian monastery, so he stopped painting sort of on the outside at the age of about 42, but he continued to keep working. Now, these two religious paintings, first of all, what you see is the most beautiful use of light. Some people actually said that Zurbarán was the Caravaggio of the Spanish Baroque. And he was aware of Caravaggio's paintings. Some people would actually go one step beyond, and Caravaggio was known for his chiaroscuro, but in Spanish Baroque, this use of what's called tenebrism. Tenebrism is like chiaroscuro, but it's a little stronger. It's a little more dark and light, very intense. So there's a similarity, but there's a little one step beyond with tenebrism. So St. Francis in meditation. St. Francis was a very positive saint. He believed in animals and life and people, and he was very revered. And Zurbarán did many, many versions of Zurbarán. This painting shows St. Francis in meditation. He looks down and he studies this memento mori. A memento mori, of course, is a reminder of our own mortality. And so a skull, of course, we can sort of understand what a skull might reference, but it also represents Adam and mankind. So he's contemplating sort of the fate of mankind. But if you look at the two paintings, you see a lot of similarities. This use of light, you see this dark, dark background. And then also more muted palette, more monochromatic. Well, of course, that isn't exactly true with the Coton, but you do see that in the gray ledge, the very inky black of both paintings. Now, the Sanchez de Coton is, as I said, in the San Diego Museum of Art, and it's one of my favorite paintings. I love these Spanish Baroque still lifes. So it's a quince, cabbage, and cucumber with a melon. And why are they hanging like that? Well, I told a story when I did Spanish Baroque, and the story was I lived in a Renaissance building, an old rundown Renaissance building in a little town called Zamora, and we didn't have refrigeration. What did we do? We were encouraged by the locals to hang the fruit above the windowsill because that way it doesn't rot or get as contaminated.
I don't know how to shut it off.
Excuse me? Do we have a comment?
Sorry.
I will continue. If someone has a comment, please maybe put it in the chat or let me know. So they were hanging to avoid spoilage. The other thing is around this time, 1602, the Spanish and the Italians were beginning to really study planetary information. They were looking to really understand the planetary world. This was done about 7 years before Galileo. So we can't exactly say this was influenced by Galileo, but they were studying the planets. And so this could be conceived of the fruits and vegetables as being actually planetary devices. Another thing is Coton had a very aristocratic and intellectual following, and it could be a reference, these orbs could be a reference to Archimedes' hyperbola, which is a mathematical and related to mathematics and physics. So that might be part of it. Now, another thing is what both show to me is this kind of otherworldliness. The Coton almost looks as if we're not looking at the natural world. We're kind of in the middle of the natural world as it goes into spiritual world. So that's what I love about it. It's kind of in this mysterious quality. Both of them have this element of mystery. And lastly, look at this magnificent light as it falls on the sliver of melon and the open melon full of seeds. It's just absolutely beautiful. And a last thing I'll say is you have this cucumber and the slice of melon cantilevered over this very plain ledge. And that also shows his skill as an artist, that he can actually create something beyond our kind of frame of reference. So that's two artists who were very well, was everyone very well aware of Coton's work, and he was greatly inspired by it. Now, this is a very interesting pairing. And you might say mentor, more like rivals. But again, when I was doing my research, I know that Guercino did study with Annabella Carracci, but I like the story of his involvement with Guido Reni. So let's talk a little bit about these Italian Baroque paintings. First of all, Il Guercino has a funny name because he was from a very poor family, and his eyes, he was born with a congenital issue, cross eyes. So they called him squint-eyed, which is a little pejorative. But that's where the name comes from. And then we have this biblical reference, the return of the prodigal son. And the story is about acceptance and forgiveness from the Bible. And what we have here in our Timken collection is this wonderful return of the prodigal son. And what we have is the father welcomes his son who has taken his inheritance and fled and spent it all. And he returns very contrite and very sad that he has disappointed his family, but his father is welcoming. He feels that he can accept his son, and forgiveness is a really big part of this as a biblical reference. What's really interesting about this painting is you can see the beautiful cloud formations, and both Reni and Guercino were known for their being great colorists. The other thing we have is we have a servant on the left who is drawing back a curtain to prepare a party that the father has asked because he wants to welcome his son in an appropriate manner. What's interesting that you often see, you see in the Timken's paintings and other collections, that often someone from that time of, that particular time in history, which would be, the 17th century, is dressed and involved with these two men who are dressed in the style more of antiquity. So that's kind of an interesting connection. Now, Ghercino was actually Reni's rival, but he was greatly influenced by him. In fact, we have the Aurora on the right, but we also have Il Ghercino doing many renditions of Aurora as well. So the fact that he copied Reni and some of the Aurora elements, and you can also see the color, there's similarities in the color. But the difference is that Ghercino uses a much more three-dimensional style in creating these forms. The bodies are more muscular. Reni doesn't quite do that. His is a little more ephemeral, a little thinner, less developed. But what happened was that Guido Reni was actually sort of the most important artist of, and I was trying to recall his, he was in Rome. Oh, no, I'm sorry. He wasn't in Rome. He was in, it skips my mind, but we'll move on. I believe it was Bologna. And so he had this big studio with all these artists. And eventually he had this rivalry with Ghercino and didn't really like him. But when Reni died, Ghercino, because he had studied Reni and had a lot of connections, he came over and took over the studio. So it was more of a rivalry and inspiration and kind of a takeover. But quickly, I do want to talk a little bit about the Reni. So Aurora was a fresco, and it's quite remarkable. We've structured it here more like a painting so you can see the comparison, but what is the story about? Well, Aurora from Greek mythology was dawn. And this is a way of dawn bringing in the new day. And so what we have is to the right, and I will point this out right here, we have Aurora, and oh, pardon me, I'll just have to go back for a second. We have Aurora on kind of on a cloud, and she is leading I beg your pardon. She is leading, oh, we better go back. She's leading the way for Apollo. And Apollo is in this chariot. And this chariot is drawn by 4 horses. And Apollo is this blonde god. And we have these women who are considered the hours. So we're opening up the day. And then we have the little phosphorus here who's bringing light to the day. And we have the wind being blown like zephyrs. So it is an incredibly remarkable mythological subject matter. And as I mentioned, this is biblical, this is mythological, but there was a great cross-pollination of these two artists. Now I'm going to go to a much more standard mentorship. So this one is a little less, is more wrapped in a package kind of mentorship. So we have the Veneto, our wonderful Bartolomeo Veneto. And it's portrait of a lady in a green dress. And on the right, we have Gentile Bellini. And if you recall from my Venetian Renaissance lecture, the Bellini family, Giovanni, Jacopo, Gentile, were a family of great artists who were so inspirational to other Venetian artists. Now, at first, Gentile was considered the Bellini to have paint your portrait. Eventually, Giovanni kind of takes over as a little bit more preeminent, but that doesn't matter, just kind of a little point I wanted to make. So Veneto and Bellini, Veneto was very influenced by Bellini. He studied with Bellini. He was mentored by Bellini. And like Bellini, he painted the portraits of the aristocracy. So on the left, we have a highborn woman from the court of Isabella d'Este. And on the right, we have a sultan, Mehmed II, and he had asked Bellini to come to Constantinople and paint his portrait. So I'll explain that in just a little bit, but I do want to talk about our wonderful Veneto. So here we have a very highborn woman, and you can see that in all manner of dress. She has this elaborate costume, these removable sleeves, satin and velvet, and the lapis in her hair, and this very exquisite floral arrangement, the lapis beads, which indicate that that she was of great wealth. Just every element of this costume screams aristocracy. Now, she was in the court, but it has been said that perhaps this is a posthumous portrait because of the very pale skin that she has. So we're not sure if this was painted after her demise. The second thing I want to point out is the falconeering gloves. Now, it was first thought that these were definitely falconeering gloves because the aristocrats in Italy and other parts of Europe had this fun activity of falcon training. However, the glove is in the wrong hand. So we're not sure if honestly this is a falconeering glove or maybe just thicker gloves. I have a feeling it's falconeering because just the way she's holding her hand would be more of that style. So she doesn't smile, even though she's an aristocrat. And I often tell you that's because they didn't have great teeth at that time. So very few people would smile. Now you have a little card on the left here, and that is the signature of the artist. So Veneto did study with Bellini in Venice. But here's the story. Bellini, as I mentioned earlier, was called to Constantinople for about a year to work for the Sultan, Mohammed II. Now, why? Why was that so? Well, the Ottoman Empire was kind of at odds with Venice, but when the Ottoman Empire came through and took over Constantinople, they knew that they had to have some kind of relationship with the city of Venice. They're both close to the Mediterranean, even though Venice is really on the Adriatic, but they have connections to the waterways of the Mediterranean. What Venice was getting from the Ottoman Empire and that part of the world, they were getting manuscripts because this is manuscript illuminations, silver, spices, linen and cotton and silk. So it was really important for the Venetians to have a great relationship with the Ottoman Empire and in Constantinople. And I hope one day, if you can, to travel there because it's one of the most remarkable cities I've ever seen. But let's talk a little bit more specifically about this portrait. It is so interesting because you have the Sultan in his, with a turban and this little top portion, a taj, which was used to show his high status and also his religious importance. He wears a kaftan, a very beautiful red crimson kaftan, and he has a fur collar. What's interesting is his face is very narrow and almost unflattering in a sense. But he was kind of a sickly guy, and a couple years, I think, after this was painted, he did die of something like gout. Now, in the foreground of this portrait, we have very ornate Ottoman style, like a cloth that's been embedded with all manner of jewels. Now, this says here, Sultan Mohammed, conqueror of the world, because he thought he was a pretty important guy, and he was. What is so remarkable about this painting is the foreground and the middle ground are actually combined. It has a very, very shallow space, which is unique. The other thing you see here is this exquisite arch that is so hyper detailed, exquisitely captured, inlaid, beautiful, but you don't see that same detail quite in the portrait. So it's very remarkable how you can see Bellini's gift at detail, but it's not quite as evident in this portrait. So suffice to say, Bellini was the mentor of Veneto. They did encounter each other in Venice, and you can see some similarities, but mostly the connection is that they're both painting very important people. All right, so I'm sorry, I'm going to go on. Now, our Veronese. So we just talked about Bellini and Veneto, and we're going to continue to talk about Venetian Renaissance artists. So Veronese was a later Venetian Renaissance artist. He would be in the time after Titian and Giorgione and Bellini. He was in the second generation of Italian Venetian Renaissance. And his work was more inspired by Tintoretto, who came after Titian. So this Veronese is in our very own Timken collection. It's a remarkable Renaissance painting. Now, unfortunately, we have a little bit of a typo here. It should have been Saint Justine. So no problem there. I'll just kind of just make a comment about that. So how are these two artists connected? Badile was the first, Antonio Badile was the very first mentor to Veronese. Now, Veronese did have other mentors, but he did study at the age of 14 with Badile. And what you see here is a martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. So we have two very religious paintings. In the background of the Badile, you see the city of Rome, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but we'll go first to our Veronese. So one other key point I think is interesting is when Veronese was 14, he studied with Badile, but he also married his daughters subsequently, and Badile became not only his mentor, but his father-in-law. So I found that kind of interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the Timken painting. So here we have this beautiful Saint Justina, and she's dressed in a really elaborate costume. Why is that? She was an aristocrat in ancient times, and she also was the principal saint for the city of Venice and Padua, two very economically successful cities. And she gazes at the infant Saint John the Baptist and the Madonna and Child. So we have the infant Jesus here being held by Mary, and Saint John is tickling him and pulling his feet. And then we have here Saint Elizabeth, and she is commenting in a way by the way she looks at the children, and so does Mary, with deep sadness. Why is that? Because it kind of predates, and they sort of know, they prophesize what might happen to their children. So that is why there's sort of a little bit of a sadness in the faces of the women. You can also see this remarkable use of architectural elements here. It's actually a brick wall. You can see Elizabeth is folding laundry from a basket. You see some elements of landscape here, and this magnificent light, this beautiful light, and also this really muted, exquisite use of color. They're very three-dimensional. This almost appears to be more Baroque in its sensibility because of this really capturing the three-dimensionality of these figures. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the Badile, the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. So under Diocletian, under Diocletian, Saint Sebastian was martyred for his beliefs. So he was tied to a pole and shot with arrows, sort of more gruesome than anything. And here we have the arrows here, they've fallen on this tabletop. And then we have here in the background, Rome. This is a lot more, I would say, kind of traditional stylistically. You can see this is more kind of hedging toward the Baroque, and this one is a little bit more squarely in the Renaissance, more classical. But the story goes that even though Saint Sebastian was shot through with arrows, he survived. He was aided, I can't recall with whom, but he was aided by one of the, a religious figure. He was aided by her, and he was taken down from this pole, and he went to Diocletian and he said, listen, you really have to understand what I'm trying to speak of. And Diocletian said, oh no, we're not interested, and then finally kills him. So a really sad story, one of the 12 disciples, but we do have quite a bit of inspiration, but not so much similarity. And as I pointed out, Veronese was quite young when he was in the studio of Badile, but he was his first true mentor. I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay, now we're going to go into more neoclassicism and the later Baroque. This is our very own Jacques-Louis David and portrait of Cooper Penrose. Now, if you recall, Jacques-Louis David for the later part of the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century, he was considered the preeminent painter. His first teacher was really Francois Boucher. And we do have a Boucher in the Timken, but I wanted to look kind of at a slightly different relationship and see, because this is more closely stylistically aligned, Jacques-Louis David really kind of disdained Boucher's Rococo style and inspiration because, you know, David was involved in the French Revolution. He only survived because Napoleon wanted him to paint his portrait. So he kept him going because he would have, you know, been beheaded. But he was such an amazing painter that they kept him alive. But Jacques-Louis David, when he was a young artist, he studied with Boucher, but he was not interested in this Rococo. And so he looked at Joseph Marie Vian and he said, I really want to study with this guy. He met him in his art training. Well, it's not quite clear if Marie Vian took him on. It's sometimes said that he said, you can be inspired by me, but I'm not going to study too closely with you because I'm too old to take on a student. But you can look at my work, you can talk to me, but I'm not going to take you on like Boucher did. But there is sort of a similar sensibility. This is a portrait of a person who lived. Cooper Penrose was Irish. He was a linen merchant, I believe, very successful. So he asked the preeminent artist of that time, Jacques-Louis David, can you paint my portrait? And David said, of course. But what Cooper Penrose was very careful about is he was a very wealthy man and he did not want to appear too affluent. So the way that David paints him is a much more subtle manner because he was a Quaker and Quakers did not flaunt wealth. So Jacques-Louis David decided, I'm going to paint him in a style that's a little more, puts him a little more in his place. So here we have this lowering of the figure in the seated chair, and there's all this space. And that indicates, kind of lowers his stature a bit. Now, I beg your pardon, what's so remarkable about this is look at the face. Look how beautifully he captures the lines, the security and depth of this individual, and also the hands. And I've mentioned this many times, faces and particular hands are probably the most difficult element of the human body for artists to depict. He's in a very muted background with the light, the chiaroscuro falls on his face. He wears a very subtle set, a jacket with a linen tie. It's beautiful. This chair is embellished greatly. So, but it's very elegant and he's seated in a lower triangular form. And that is to sort of diminish him being too highborn. Now, Joseph Marie Vian is doing something a little different. This is, I would say, more Baroque. It's not Rococo. It's more Baroque. And you see the accoutrements of the day, you know, dove of peace and the little brazier here and some flowers. But melancholy was kind of a concept developed in ancient Greece. Like, what are our, let's say, our emotions? And melancholy would also often be depicted with her head down. Now, I see that we are really almost out of time, so I just want to go really quickly. This Peter Klaus and Balthasar van Alst. Now, Peter Klaus is in our collection. This is a breakfast and smoker's requisite. Peter Klaus was from Haarlem. He painted mostly there. This is a very monochromatic, exquisite painting with Venetian glass, terracotta picture here, the smoked fish. And it really is a memento mori because it really talks about, or vanitas, it talks about the ephemeral nature of life. Glass half full, dying fish, the ashes going down. Now, van der Alst was very inspirational to Peter Klaus, but they met in Haarlem. Balthasar van Alst was actually probably Flemish. He came to Haarlem, where Peter Klaus lived, because of all the flower markets there. It was a place for growing and marketing flowers. So you have a much more ornate, this was done with Chinese porcelain that was, they're great traders, the Dutch. Look at all this fruit and these tulips. Remember the time of tulipomania. So they were very inspirational, really. He was very inspirational, of course, to Peter Klaus. And I do want to point out these seashells. These come from East and West, not Africa, probably Indies, East and West Indies. We have all kinds of remarkable fruit in this beautiful open basket. But they met each other in Haarlem, and they were, and Klaus was very influenced by him. Quickly, we have our very own Van Ruysdael, a view of Haarlem and the bleaching fields. Now, Van Ruysdael in the Timken was known for all these views of Haarlem. And just really quickly before Ilse asked for questions, I just want you to look at this. They met each other in Leiden, where Van Ruysdael, in Haarlem, excuse me, where both of them were working. So if you look at Cornelius' room, this looks very similar to the Van Ruysdael. So you can see almost, you might even think it was done by Van Ruysdael. So I see that Ilse might be ready to take questions, and I'll just kind of wrap it up there. I can't hear you, Ilse.
I apologize. We have a question from Katie. She says, I noticed that Coton and Sorberon are also chiaroscuro. Do you think that it was a technique picked up by Sorberon from Coton's work to display gravity within the pieces?
100% true. That's a really good observation. I would say 100%. And I would also say that, pardon me, did you see sort of this idea of tenebrism too, that really, even beyond the chiaroscuro and that use of light, because Zurbaran, they called him the Caravaggio of Spain. So definitely this whole thing about light was really important. Now, I'm not sure if it's the same question about Coton's work seems more hopeful than Zurbaran's. That's a good point. And I think in those two comparisons, maybe so, because there's more color in the Coton, and you're seeing more elements of the natural world. And Zurbaran looks, down with sort of very stark and kind of sad way of looking. So yeah, I think the Coton is more positive, and I think Zurbaran definitely looked at the light of Coton, as did other Spanish Baroque artists. Well, that was a very good question, by the way.
Yeah, I was curious about that because they were each done in like a short span of time. Like it was only a few decades, and it kind of seems like a huge shift, even if there's a clear influence in like styling, but the context, like the timeline, I'm curious to know what happened in like the span of 30 years.
Yeah, that is a really good question, actually. And I'm not sure I can answer exactly that, but you have to remember too that Coton ended up going to a Carthusian monastery. So he still was painting, but he, for quite a bit of the latter part of his life, he was not as prevalent, let's say, in Spanish society, because he was in a very restricted monastery.
Well, before you go, I would like to remind you that this tour and other tours put on previously through the Timken Museum can be found on our social media channels, our Facebook and our YouTube page. And if you'd like further information on future tours being put on by the museum, please check out our website events calendar for those details. And thank you again for joining us this morning. And thank you, Karen, again for such a wonderful presentation. Goodbye.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Ilse.
Oh, it seems we might have another question.
Oh, of course. I'm all ears.
Okay. She asks, each portrait you've shown has a deliberate pose, oftentimes mimicking the poses of their mentors' portraits. Do you think that certain posture in portraits was also something passed down by mentors, or was it more dependent on the trends of the era?
Wow, what a good question. I think both. I definitely think both. I think it's definitely stylistically. And also, okay, so for example, with the Jacques-Louis David, there was what he was trying to accomplish is to show that this person was important, but not show too much of his quote decadence, because he was a very wealthy man. So the way they position the figure in that triangular form kind of lowers the face and the body. So that was in a way to kind of show, make a comment on his stature. But I absolutely agree with this, particularly the second part is definitely stylistically and what was kind of happening in those countries. Because if you look at the Bellini, the Mehmed, the Sultan, that is so different from the other painting and, the Veneto. And when you think about it, they don't really look too much alike, even though that was in all of this talk, they were probably the most connected in terms of mentor and teacher. That was the most connected relationship in all of what we just looked at, pretty much. So it's a little bit of both, but that's an excellent question, by the way.
And we have one more from Raquel. She asks, what makes Venetian's painting so unique?
What a great question. And I love that question. First of all, probably the most individualized idea is color. The Venetians were color over line. So in other parts of the Renaissance, let's say Sienese, Florentine, they were not quite as focused on color, but the Venetians, if you look at the Venetian palette, it's so rich and deep. They also used some different glazing techniques that made them very, again, the word unique, very unique. So it's the glazing, it's the color, and also if you've been to Venice, the light is really remarkable there. So it's stylistic. If you look at a Giorgione, Titian, Tintoretto, really you can definitely see that there's this Venetian color strain through them. But I love that question, because that's a really good question, by the way.
All wonderful questions. Thank you so much, everybody. And again, I'll remind you that you can find our previous tours and this tour on social media. And if you would like to join future tours, they're on our website events calendar. And again, thank you so much, Karen. And I'll see everybody soon.
Yes. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you for joining.